Hi, I'm Satan. You've probably heard of me. I was talking with my evil demon minions earlier, and I realized that there's been some confusion about who we are and what we do. Naturally, the Bible is often the best place people go to learn about how to prepare for attacks from us, but it's a big book, so people often aren't aware of all the ins and outs. Today, I interview Bible scholar John Harvey Walton on him and his dad's extensive treatment of what the Bible teaches and doesn't teach about me and my demons. So, how are you doing today, Dr. Walton?
I'm doing all right. It's a pretty good day. We're starting to get some nice weather out here for once.
There you go. Awesome. All right. So, for people that haven't read the book, could you give us a general overview about the things that you were arguing in the book, the general purpose of it?
So the book was written to address a fundamentally a approach to theology, an approach to a very broad worldview of theology, which wants to conceive of reality as kind of being defined by an ongoing conflict between God and Satan, or some some evil equivalent
Mm-hmm.
of that. And not only as this being a component of reality, but also a major and fundamental teaching of both the contents of the biblical text and the doctrine of the Christian faith. And so, primarily, what I was doing is trying to unpack this idea a little bit, um, and most specifically about the biblical passages that are used to defend it, because we didn't have a lot of space to talk about everything related. Uh, so the primary purpose of this book was to go through all of the passages that mention Satan, demons, or things that interpreters throughout history have assumed are similar to Satan and demons, and talk about whether or not those appearances of these characters support this narrative, both as even a thing that it thinks is there, but also a thing that it thinks is
Mm,
important, that it's
mm,
is part of what it really wants to get across and what it thinks its readers are supposed to understand, or supposed to internalize them, and then what they're supposed to do about it. And
yeah.
the argument I was ultimately trying to make was that this worldview is not necessarily affirmed in the Bible. It's not found at all in the Old Testament. It is alluded to in the New Testament because it's something that is a part of the broader environment of Second Temple Judaism and the Greco-Roman world in general. But it is not considered even there where it exists to be particularly important, or something that is very urgent for people to learn if they don't know it already and then act on in certain ways. It's taken
Mm,
for granted as part of the vocabulary that they use to think about the world, as part of what they think they're doing, the way the world works, what the human condition is just assumed, and there's a couple of references to that assumption. But then when you go back in the Old Testament, it's not even there at all. They don't even have the
mm,
framework of one good God versus one evil other thing.
mm,
So that was my objective, is to ultimately argue that I called it conflict theology. This idea of a war between God and Satan is not a biblical theology. It's not something that the Bible teaches. It's not a fundamental Christian dogma, unless your church says it is, but that's a different kind of thing. And that's so. But this was about biblical theology, so I was saying that that is not a component of biblical theology, and therefore the references to Satan, demons, and other things are there for other reasons. And then I started to talk about some of what those reasons were, what they were trying to say when they mentioned these things.
Mm, okay. So a big, I guess, framework that you apply to the Bible is, in regards to inspiration. Of course, it's an ancient text, and we don't affirm literally everything that is ever said. When Satan says a lie or in the text, or if a bad figure does something wrong, it doesn't necessarily mean that like we should do that too, right? So we have to apply a framework, a way to look at how this biblical text applies to us today. And what you and your dad have talked about is like, hey, the Bible was written to us, but not for us.
Other
No.
way around, for us, but not to us.
There you go. Anyway, so um, yeah, could you talk about like, I guess, and the important thing there is like, what is the biblical text trying to teach, not just, and you talk about references. Could you talk about all that just a little bit more
Right.
detailed to give people
So,
an idea of how you're reading it?
yeah. So the Bible is not an encyclopedia of theological facts. It's not
Mm,
it's not even a theology textbook. It's not there to lay out information for someone to come into with a blank slate and learn information. That's not the way that it's written. Um,
mm,
it's written into a context. It's written by people. We say inspired people, but still by people, um, for reasons to people. And the things that they're trying to say are all working in the context of who is writing and who they are writing to, because that's how communication works. So they're not taking a blank sheet and writing down everything they know, a list of facts that they want people in their audience to internalize and memorize, and then handing it to them. There's
yeah.
no part of it that works that way. Um, it's all whatever they're doing, and it's going to vary depending on the genre of the book that it is being done for a reason in order to say something. Um,
Mm,
so when we're looking for things, we're trying to ask questions, like, are there demons? We don't know. That's a question that we're coming in with a blank slate.
mm,
We're looking at the Bible to educate us. And the thing is, if it wasn't written to educate the people that it's being written to, if they weren't
mm,
in the same position as us, if they weren't asking the people who wrote the Bible, what are these things? What are demons? Please tell us in this book that you're writing. If they're not asking that, then we can't assume that we're going to get that answer. We're only going to get the answers to the questions that the people were asking who it was written to, because
mm,
that's who it was written to. So when I'm talking about the difference between affirmations and references, affirmations is the text's message. This is what it was trying to convey to its audience, the things that it wanted them to know that it thought were important enough. As I say it, I mean the text as an extension of the human and divine authors combined, wanted wanted them to know, wanted them to get out of it.
mm,
The references are elements from the drawn from the pre-existing knowledge of the audience in order to convey that information.
mm,
So if we're approaching the text to look for education, which this book was talking about, it's assuming that you're doing that, then you're looking to ask, education is an answer to something that you don't know. It's new information. So, what's new information? Does anything that the text says about Satan, demons, other things, is that new? Would the people reading this have not known that already? And if they would have known it, it's not giving them new information by definition, that it is not designed to teach them these facts.
mm,
It might potentially be designed to affirm these facts, to remind them that this is important, that, this thing that you already know about, pay attention to that. But if that's true, if that's what it's doing, then part of that message will tell them why it's important. Why do you need to know this? Why shouldn't you forget this thing that you know? And I talked about that as well when it came up. But the basic idea of a reference is that a reference is something that the audience already knows that is being
Hmm.
invoked in order to communicate something they don't know, or something that whatever it is the author wants to tell them, that is the reason why the book was worth being written down. Because once
Yeah.
again, it's not written down simply as a repository of information. The best example I have that I provided in the book for how this works is some other aspects of the ancient worldview, because we're talking about, Satan and demons in the terms of a cosmic warfare. That's a question of cosmology and broader cosmic worldview. So what else in their cosmology do they talk about in ways that we already have a better kind of intuitive understanding of what they're doing?
Yeah.
And the physical structures of the world is a big one. um, there's quite a bit in the Bible that makes reference to how they think the world is put together. It is a disk held up by pillars under an ocean. There's mountains around it. There's a dome or a plane, sometimes several of them, that are above that. They have the stars inscribed on them. The
Hmm.
sun and the moon are underneath that dome. And this is the basic way that they see cosmology. Um, Now, unless you're part of this new flat earth thing, most people, most of the time, who are reading the Bible know that this is just an idea that they had. That's how they thought the world worked. So when they want to talk about, in Genesis 1, where does God put the sun? They don't say that God put the sun in the vacuum of space 90 million miles away from Earth. They say God put the sun in the firmament, which is this area in between the disk of the Earth and the disk of the sky. Um, and they do that because they're not trying to educate their audience about where the sun is. They're trying to educate their audience about, you know, did God put it there? Maybe. And I also said that's not necessarily true either, even though that's what it says. The audience knew that God put the sun there. So that's not really what it's telling them either. It's
Hmm.
telling them why the creation story, they're telling this for a reason about how the world is setting up in terms of who did it or as a template for something else. And I don't really want to talk about that too much because it's a very broad topic. But the point is
Yeah.
that when we read about the Bible describing the physical structures of the cosmos, we know that this is not a divine imperative to recalibrate our worldview to pre modern science.
Hmm.
Um, we know that it's mentioning these things um, because their significance to the audience. We can tell what their significance was, and it's saying something else. And what exactly that is depends on the context. But we're not saying, well, it says the Earth is a disk, therefore, I guess that's what God wants us to have to believe. Or it says there's pillars, or it says there's a dome. Um,
Yeah.
that's not the point. That's never the point. And the reason why it's never the point is because the Bible's not a repository of information. It's not a treatise on cosmology. They're not. That's not what they want the audience to
Yep.
know and to remember and to think is important after they finish reading this book. And my argument is basically that Satan, demons, and other things like demons are essentially the same.
Hmm. Okay. So just for people that maybe didn't catch that, so you're saying that this idea of like demons, spiritual beings, Satan, that's part of their cosmology in
Yes,
their eyes? Can you
yes, it's
talk
part of
about
their
that?
it's part of their cosmology. It's part of their underlying assumptions about how the world works. These are ideas that have meaning for them. The words mean things, and they're being used as references. Those meanings and those ideas are being invoked to talk about something else.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay. So I guess in that case, that like an important question is like for us, obviously, like the stars, the cosmology is a scientific idea, like it's the study of nature. But you're saying that to them, the cosmology is not purely scientific, if you even would call it that. That it's very spiritual in that regards. And what you're saying is that if we're gonna, you know, see that the biblical text is not teaching us cosmology, that not only includes like the scientific aspects of what they believe, but also the some of the spiritual. Is that what you're claiming?
No, that's not what I'm saying. So
Okay.
the whole idea that there's a conceptual difference between the physical or natural and the spiritual
Mm-hmm.
is a modern idea. They did not have this. So
Mm-hmm.
um, the things that they call demons would have been just as part of the natural world as anything else. I mean, a lot of times they're
Mm-hmm.
interchangeable with animals. Um, More the point is that it's it's not what they're talking about. So we don't say that, well, the Bible's an authority on spiritual things but not physical things. That's not what the boundary is. It's the Bible doesn't care what the sky looks like or where the stars actually are or where the sun actually
Mm-hmm.
is, or whether there's water underground. It does not care at all. That's completely irrelevant to anything it's trying to say. It's
Yeah.
using the defaults because it's speaking Hebrew. The words for the various elements of the cosmos are in Hebrew. They mean those things, and it's making a point about something that has nothing to do with where the stars are or where the sun is. No part of it matters. So
Right.
it if you changed it, if you said that when God made the sun, he didn't put it next to the birds under the plane of the stars. He put it 90 million miles away in the vacuum of space. That wouldn't change anything about what the affirmation is, what the authors were trying to say,
Mm-hmm.
because it doesn't matter. They're using the ideas they have, and they're not bothering to correct them, and that's what's really important. They're not trying to correct the pre-existing idea,
Yep.
um,
Mm-hmm.
and the reason why they're not is because it doesn't matter.
Hmm.
They're not trying. They're not
And
trying to
you would.
correct it. So they're not trying to correct it, and they're not trying to emphasize it. They're not trying to say,
Mm-hmm.
"Hey, this thing is important. Don't forget about this."
Right.
They're brushing past it as an aside.
Mm-hmm. And you would apply the same thinking in regards to inspiration of some like the claims about demons or Satan.
Yes,
Okay.
for
All right.
pretty much for the same reasons. That's one of the reasons. One of the things that the book does is it looks at all of these mentions
Uh,
of these characters and all the names that it uses and the things are. And it's like, okay, what's it saying about this thing? Is it something they already knew?
mm,
If it is, uh, so it always is. There's no new information. And I found that by looking. If it is information they already knew, is it telling them that this is really, really, really important to remember? And not really. Um, there's a couple of places where you could maybe try that, but I think given the context, it's pretty ambiguous.
mm,
That it's more like so things like the your enemy, the devil, is a raging lion, prowling around looking for someone to devour. That's telling them, that's reminding them of something that they already knew. But that whole passage in whichever Peter that is, um, isn't a cosmology textbook. It's not.
mm,
It's not a list of these are all of the beings in heaven and earth. It's a it's a morality argument. It's be careful and don't be bad, and that's what matters. And it's the point that he's trying to make is that you know being bad has a consequence, and the consequence he's listing of being devoured by the devil is what they knew. That's part of their worldview. That's what's important. That's what it's
Mm,
about. And it's like the same thing where if you change where the sun gets put in Genesis, if you change what the consequence of being bad is to something that fits in a different worldview, it doesn't change that message at all. It has consequences that you should be aware of. And by the way, you know that, and I'm reminding you of that because it looks like you forgot.
mm,
Um,
I see.
so that
Yeah,
again, that's the
that's really
difference.
interesting. Yeah. Okay. So just for some clarity, there was some. Obviously your book had specific goals and responding to specific things. So like it wasn't exhaustive, wasn't talking about everything. So this is kind of like a follow-up book in a way. But so just to clarify your position, for people that might have read it and like, what do they actually think about this? Clarity. Do you think the Bible teaches there is a devil? And if so, which I would assume that's true, why do you think so?
I do not think the Bible teaches that there is a devil.
Okay.
Um, like I just said, I think it's an element of their cosmology, um, like same conception as pillars of the earth or the solid plane of the sky. Um,
Mm,
I think that in the New Testament, at least, they thought that there was. It was a meaningful idea for them.
yeah.
Um, I think that is has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not we should think that there's such a thing, because they had reasons for believing this.
Mm,
And we have some reasons too that don't necessarily
yep.
have to do with the Bible, but
Mm,
the Bible does not teach this. It's some parts of it assume as part of their argument that it's true. That's not the same as teaching it.
mm,
So um, if you asked me, if you ask me, does the Bible teach that there is a person called Satan? No. Do I think there's a person called Satan? Also, no, but for different reasons. Um,
okay.
and those are kind of different questions. And again, it has to do with the idea that the Bible doesn't teach about everything that exists. It's not an encyclopedia about all of the knowledge in the world.
Mm,
It has a very specific message, and that message, I mean, I like to argue that the message is actually relatively narrow when you
mm,
when you look at it. So there's a lot of things that it doesn't teach about, and we kind of all know this. This is one of the reasons why we have things like systematic theology textbooks, why we have
mm,
2,000 years of theologians writing theology, because the Bible doesn't teach this stuff. And you either have to infer it or fill in the gaps or
yep.
sometimes just make it up because it didn't
Mm,
occur to the people who wrote the Bible to ask the questions we want answers to. And
mm,
so saying that the Bible doesn't teach about something doesn't necessarily mean anything. It has to do with how you read the Bible, not necessarily about what's true or what's real.
mm.
And I think that's a
Okay.
very important
So
distinction to make.
yeah. So just for some clarity, I remember your dad saying on an interview that the Bible, maybe I misheard him, but the Bible does teach that Satan exists, but teaches very little to nothing about him. Is that does that sound right, or do you guys have a different position, or do you have the same position on that?
You'd have to ask him. Um,
Okay.
uh, I don't actually know. The, the yeah, you'd have to ask. I don't know if he has that opinion or if he's changed it since then.
I see. Okay. All right. And just for some clarity, then, with Satan, I would assume it's the same with demons. So, do you think the Bible teaches that demons exist in the world?
Again, no, for the same reasons.
Okay.
This one is kind of interesting because it doesn't. There's not really a clear idea of what demons are.
Hmm.
There's the the way that we use that category. Like if you
Yeah.
go and check out a systematic theology book, um, it covers a lot of stuff that is not just the word daimonion, the word that literally means demon. Um, they'll put in a whole bunch of other stuff in there. And so the question is, what even is a demon when you're asking this question? And
Mm-hmm.
then you have to figure out what it is before you can figure out if it exists or not. But again, I don't think that the Bible's teaching ever concerns these cosmological elements. So it's not a it's not a cosmology textbook. It's not a bestiary. It's not teaching you about animals or creatures. So I don't think it teaches that these things are real. I think it assumes that they're real because its audience assumes that they're real. And it uses that knowledge about what they
Mm-hmm.
are in various ways to say meaningful things to the audience. But again, I don't think that that means it's teaching that they're real.
Okay. All right. And in another case, in that case, um, so you talk about this in your book. Do you think demons are like evil? So, there's a lot of passages that talk about, I guess, demons doing evil things. And of course, you're saying that not even teaching about demons at all. Say hypothetically, people don't accept that. Why would we conclude that demons aren't evil in general from texts like these?
So this gets back into the idea of what demons, what are demons, what words are being used to describe them.
Uh-huh.
So in the so in the New Testament, you have the word demon and demon possession, daimon and daimonismai, and these are primarily taking place in the realm of pre-modern medicine. Demon possession is a disease, and
Mm-hmm.
it's caused by a demon. They know what that is, and they know how to treat it. But when we look at those, when we look at what things are what things that are called demons that are driven out by Jesus and the apostles do, or what demon possessed people do,
Mm-hmm.
they're not sinning. They're not being evil. It's never, they don't like take Jesus to a murderer and have him expel a demon and now suddenly he's a righteous person. That never happens. It's always somebody who is usually harming themselves, are the most explicit
Mm-hmm.
ones we see in the Gadarene demoniacs. Um, they're scaring people, they're hurting people, they're hurting themselves. They're insane,
Yep.
and they're not they're not being criminals. They're being, I mean, the normal modern idea is that they're mentally ill of some kind. Maybe that's true. We don't know. Um, there's one where they say the term that they use for it is uh, epileptic.
Yep.
It's a selezonamide. And it's a similar idea. We think that we translated that because we think that's epilepsy. It's treated similarly, um, and it again causes the person to hurt themselves. Now it's not doesn't really matter what if we had a doctor with a time machine who could go back and look at these people and he could say, oh yeah, they had schizophrenia. It doesn't
Mm-hmm.
matter really, um, because that's not important. What's important is that they're sick, they're known to be sick, and Jesus is able to heal them. It's conceptually the same thing as, oh, that guy's paralyzed. He's sick. He's known to be sick. Jesus can heal him. That guy's blind. He's
Mm-hmm.
sick. He's known to be sick. Jesus can heal him. It's part of that litany of things.
Uh-huh.
And you wouldn't say that the demons are evil in that context any more than you would say that, blindness or paralysis is evil. Um, it's harmful, painful, scary, dangerous. That's a little bit categorically different from malicious, antisocial, um,
Yep.
things like that, things that we think evil means. So part of it is you have to talk about how you're defining these terms. Um, when we say, evil in the context of Satan
Mm-hmm.
and demons being evil, we're thinking in terms of sin, that they are um, immoral. It's a moral, social um, malice kind of acting against strategically acting against God's purposes in the world. And
Mm,
depending on what your worldview is, sometimes you would want to put all disease and all harm into that category. That's very difficult to sustain from a biblical perspective for a lot of reasons, and we can talk about that some later if you want. But the idea of demons as sinners, angels who sinned, is the main one. Um,
yeah.
you don't really see that with any instance of the word that means demon. So if you want to try to tack that category onto them, now you have to start to do some category merging. You have to talk about
Ah,
angels who sinned, which is a reference in First Peter. Are those demons? Are those the same things that are making schizophrenia symptoms? Bible doesn't say that, and it's possible that they would have thought so. It's also possible that they didn't. There's a couple of different traditions on that, which I talked about on that passage about where the demons that cause disease come from. Um, and they're very rarely the same things as the fallen angels that Peter's referring to, which is a reference to
huh.
um, an interpretation of Genesis 6. So when you're talking about that, it's unclear about what demons are. You can't make this huge category blur and lump them all together and then kind of define their properties interchangeably. I guess there's no warrant for
Yeah.
doing that unless you've already starting with this idea that, well, there must be these supernatural spiritual things that cause evil. Let's see if we can find anything in the Bible that fits that profile, in which case that's the assumption you started with. And now that's going into what you think is evil, not necessarily what the
Mm,
text is teaching is evil.
mm. Wow. Okay.
I don't know if that
And
made any
it
sense
kind
at
of,
all.
yeah, no, that so the that also kind of applies to the idea of demons being active everywhere. So, you know, I guess in modern culture, there's this idea like, hey, you could be tempted by a demon and they could be all over the place and scary, but how does that apply to the biblical text? Like, is the biblical text teaching that demons are everywhere? Are they active?
Again, I don't think it's teaching that. I think that it assumes that they exist, and it
Mm,
assumes that, at least, well, okay, the New Testament assumes that there are spiritual forces that can can and do incite people to evil.
mm,
How prevalent they are depends on who you ask.
mm,
Um, and it's more has to do with kind of a I know it when I see it type thing.
mm,
So in uh, Jesus talking to Peter, and Peter's trying to encourage him that no, of course he's not going to get killed, and Jesus turns and says, "Get behind me, Satan." Um, we don't think that Peter has been Satan in disguise the whole time. Like this isn't the temptation narrative again. We don't think that Peter got possessed in that instance, and now he's suddenly
huh,
talking like Satan entered into Peter the same way he's going to do to Judas later,
yeah.
and made Peter say this. It's more of has to do with kind of identifying where that idea is coming from. Um, and does that mean that there's a little shoulder devil who whispered that into Peter's ear to make him say that? Um, Maybe that's you get some people who think that that's how it works in this worldview, so it could be a
Mm,
reference to that. Um, More likely, there's kind of archetypal or typological ideas for how the children of God act and how the children of Satan act.
mm,
Um, so it's one of these you'll know which camp you're in you can tell which camp someone's in by watching them.
Uh-huh.
And there's a mix of it. So for most people think that you get a mix of in people. Sometimes you lean towards light, sometimes you lean towards darkness, and which one is happening at any given time, you know
Mm-hmm.
it when you see it. Um, so then the idea, of course, that once you get into the medical aspects, demon possession, demon affliction is a disease. Uh, they don't know how you catch these things. They don't know if they're contagious or not. They don't even know what contagious is really.
Mm-hmm.
So theoretically, anybody could get it, but they tended to correlate whether or not you got sick with whether or not God was angry with you, or the gods if you're a pagan. Um, so they would look at righteous people and say, well, that person's not going to get sick because he's righteous, and then they'd look at a sick person and say, oh, you must have done something bad. So yeah, there's kind of the idea that these things that everybody has a potential to come under the influence of evil forces of some kind in some capacity. It's not
Mm-hmm.
systematic for how that works. And even within the New Testament, it's not systematic for how that works or who's
Yep.
responsible for it,
Mm-hmm.
or like whether the gods gave you this affliction, or God in Judaism and Christianity gave you this affliction because he
Mm-hmm.
was upset with you, because he wanted to test you, because he wanted to challenge you, um, because he didn't care enough to stop it. Any of these reasons, or because this these evil forces took advantage of you. If some evil magician cast a spell on you, Satan's after you personally. All of these ideas are in there, and they're all more or less used interchangeably. So
Mm-hmm.
there's not a there's not a systematic presentation of it, if that makes again
Mm-hmm.
any sense at all. I know that was rambling.
That kind of gets us not necessarily into demons, but another big question is, all right, so if you're applying this to the passages about, whatever you call demons and Satan and all that, then that is going to make a lot of people ask, okay, what about the good spiritual creatures, like uh, obviously the angel of the Lord, Michael the archangel, any angels, cherubim and seraphim. What is the biblical text teaching about them?
Again, I would still say nothing for the same reasons. I didn't talk
Oh, wow,
about
okay.
them very much because that wasn't the focus. I was talking about
Right.
the cosmic duality and the cosmic warfare. So I wasn't paying much
Uh-huh.
attention to God's lower minions unless they came up. And they do come up
Mm-hmm.
occasionally. So if you read the book, I'll talk about them in there. Um,
Yep.
but it's the same thing. These are
Yep.
things that they know about. And sometimes we don't even know what they are. Like if you try to look up what an angel is, good luck. We don't know. Um, it just means messenger. And
Yep.
it's a function, not a taxon. God can send anybody as a messenger.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so when it's a divine being, which it occasionally is, there's not a good indication of either which divine being it is or what kind of divine being it is. And especially when you get into the Old Testament, there's not a conceptual distinction between the the supernatural beings we would call angels and the ones we would call demons. Um, the
Mm-hmm.
the angel of the Lord in one passage in Numbers is actually referred to as Satan. Um, the cherubim, the composite creatures who um, carry God's throne in Ezekiel and who guard the ark, um,
Yep.
are the kind of things that would have been called demons, or would have been the same kinds of creatures as the things we would call demons, because there's no word for demon in Hebrew. There's no word for demon in any cognate language. They just don't have this as a category. But this idea of a composite creature, creatures that's made of a bunch of different other creatures mashed together, that
Mm-hmm.
is part of the divine world and is used by the gods as a as a mount, as a draft animal for a chariot, as a guard dog. These are things that have equivalents outside of the Bible. And they're a lot closer conceptually to other things that the Bible calls demons than they are to the things that your medieval theologians called angels.
Mm,
I actually argued that the seraphim, the the things in Ezekiel's throne vision, which there's not a lot of references to. That's the only real reference to them as divine beings. There's a couple other uses of that word. The word seraphim means burning. Um, it's used a couple of times relative to snakes, and so there's this
mm,
idea that what these creatures are winged serpents, which are probably on fire. Um, and the other reference to creatures like that is again in Numbers, where they are sent to attack and torture the Israelites as one of God's many expressions of displeasure. So the idea is these things are almost literally what a what anyone else in the ancient Near East would have called a demon. They're creatures that live they're composite creatures, a mash of different animals. They live out in the wilderness in a desolate area.
mm.
They're used by the gods as afflictions of punishment, and they also can
Huh.
periodically serve as the gods' heralds, which is what they're doing in Ezekiel 6. So these are this I said in the book, this is probably the most explicit depiction of a demon anywhere in either testament. And ironically, it's one of the ones that we would consider to not be that. So the idea that there's this categorical difference that you could tell is part of the whole thing that's the problem with this worldview. The idea of, especially in the Old Testament, the idea of a whole monolithic realm of goodness and a whole monolithic realm of evil fighting each other just does not exist. The
Mm,
the categories of good and evil aren't categories in the Old Testament world.
yeah.
And
Yeah.
even in the New Testament world, they don't align as precisely as they would in the theology textbooks that a lot of your audience is reading.
Mm, right, right, right. Okay. So that's really, really interesting. Okay. So one argument for seeing the Bible as not teaching much of anything about Satan is this idea that in the Old Testament, and I've interviewed people on it, where it does not mention Satan. Maybe one or two vague places, possibly, but really that's a difficult case to make. So I think we pretty confidently said like, hey, Satan is not mentioned in the Old Testament. All of a sudden, we see this idea of a Satan, an opponent to God, come up into the intertestamental, the Second Temple period between the New and the Old Testament, and then all of a sudden, the New Testament is talking about that. So it seems like, hey, if it wasn't even in the Old Testament, maybe the New Testament isn't teaching it either. Uh, how much weight do you put into an argument like that? The shifting of the views of Satan, how valuable is that to understanding what the Bible's teaching?
It's valuable because it helps understand and clarify that ideas have a context, that the words that people use mean things. So
Hmm.
the reason why Satan's not in the Old Testament is because that Hebrew word doesn't mean something concrete.
Hmm.
It's a generic word. It means adversary, and it can apply to a whole bunch of different people. Um,
Hmm.
so the word means something, and you can tell what it means by what it's used, by how it's used, and by the world of the people who are using it. And
Right.
that's the same. The same is true of the Greek words in the New Testament. They mean things, but they mean things because the environment that they're in, that they're being used in, gives them meaning.
Hmm.
So the idea that Satan arises as an idea in the intertestamental period, well, that's useful to know because that tells you what the Greek word Satan means, or potentially means, because there's actually a lot of different names for this character that
Right.
if you get really into the scholarship, it's not always clear that it's the same character. But
Huh.
the concept of, at least, regardless of which name you use for it, of this kind of
Mm-hmm.
um, either one or several monolithic or otherwise like cosmically powerful. Sometimes there's not just one. Sometimes there's a bunch of them. Sometimes there's a bunch of them in succession. It's not systematic at all. Um, Even in the Bible, it's not systematic at all. But that there's this idea that people could be referring to that
Mm-hmm.
tells you what these ideas mean. Um, because again, when the New Testament's when the New Testament comes off the press and the people are reading the letter that's been circulated or the gospel that's been circulated, they don't see. And then Satan came. Oh, who's that? I wonder who that is. Let me look in all of these other books that they just printed off and see if I can find that word anywhere else and figure out. Let's piece together a profile of who that is. No, they don't do that. They know who that is. It's
Mm-hmm.
it's named because they know who that is. So when you're when you're looking at what this word means when the New Testament uses it, Satan, devil, Belial, whatever they all are, you go back to what it means to them, not necessarily the word in the Old Testament that gave the intertestamental interpreters the idea to develop the detailed cosmology slash demonology that we then was then disseminated enough to be commonplace in the New Testament time that they could make casual reference to it and people would know what they meant. Um,
Mm-hmm.
you look at just the last step of that. What did the people who were reading this text think this word means? And they weren't getting it from doing a Hebrew word study. They were getting it from their culture, which created this idea. And yeah, that's important to understand because that tells you when you're trying to construct an idea in your head because you don't know what that word means. You look
Mm-hmm.
at the name Belial in First Corinthians, you have no idea what that means. You have to go look, and the place that you should go look for that, just like you would for any word, is look in the other documentation we have from around the same time of when this was written. What did they think it means? Does anybody define it clearly enough that you can tell? And
Mm-hmm.
then you kind of assume that they're broadly similar because that's how language works.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And so something that a lot of people, kind of in response to your book that they were thinking about was that, hey, maybe Satan isn't in the New Testament, or sorry, maybe Satan really isn't in the Old Testament, but we have extremely similar concepts of the idea of Satan. You have like the serpent in Genesis, a chaos creature. You have Leviathan. You have Daniel 10 that refers to Michael and these other entities. You have like the sons of God. You have very similar concepts of evil and they're against God. They rebelled against God, and maybe that's not Satan in particular, but that is just the way the biblical writers are describing the same thing. What do you think about that?
So this is a very standard component of the idea of the Bible spanning cosmic warfare theology that I was talking
Uh,
about that I wrote this book to examine and
mm,
ultimately write against. And it's based on a lot of assumptions. Again, first assumption being that this dualistic good and evil conflict model is true, and we just need to find some references to shoehorn into it.
mm,
So this is usually taking the New Testament's depiction of cosmic combat, which is much more explicit because it's something that it's an idea that actually exists in their culture, and reading the Old Testament into it because it assumes that the Old Testament has to be systematic. It can't be saying anything different because the Bible is monolithic and systematic, which of course I say it's not. Um, so if you're trying to find that warfare in the Old Testament, you first have to see if you can have any dualism in the Old Testament. Is this idea of good versus evil part of their world?
mm,
And if you start looking into that, you very quickly realize that there is not actually a lot of overlap between what we, meaning the later dualistic cosmology and theology, calls
Yeah.
evil, and chaos, what things like the Leviathan represent. And it has to do with their cosmology is defined along different lines. Um, it's basically the best way I can describe it is in terms of um, insiders and outsiders. You have the uh, the idea of the world is centered around a concept of order and harmony, which they define pretty much around themselves, around their culture and their
Mm-hmm.
ideals. It involves that's fairly homogenous throughout most of the ancient Near East, and again, it even continues mostly into the classical world as well. It's about ideas of order, justice. Everything is in its place. Everything works the way it should. It's been
Mm-hmm.
set up and established by the gods, and everything just works. And outside of that is just outside. It's everything. It's a
Mm-hmm.
negation of that. It's the absence of that. So evil, chaos, is conceived mostly in terms of absence. It's so the unformed nothingness in Genesis 1,
Mm-hmm.
formless and void. That's chaos in its purest form. Um, it's embodied by parts of the world where no one lives or no one can live, like the wilderness, mountains, the ocean. None of these are evil in the terms of that we would think in terms of cosmic dualism. The ocean's not evil. The desert's not evil. It's other and it's outside. You also get this idea of disrupting the ordered system from within. So there's this idea of absence and the idea of disruption. They're two distinct concepts, but
Mm-hmm.
disruption from within, so undermining the system by something that's inside the system, usually through injustice or um, boundary traversal, somebody getting out of their box. These are the main ways to do this. And that's what we would call evil, because that has the moral social component that we associate with the word evil.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not something that the chaos creatures, the things that the gods battle in cosmology, are ever depicted as doing because they're outside. They can't do this. They can threaten sometimes when the system collapses, chaos comes in and takes its place.
Yeah.
But there's no monolithic account of God being opposed to chaos universally either. I mean, the one of the most basic expressions of chaos, again, chaos in its purest form, is the cosmic ocean, which is God's weapon in the flood. That's what that is. He takes
Mm-hmm.
the outside world and just basically dumps it onto the ordered world, resets the entire cosmos, and then recreates it. That's
Mm-hmm.
God using chaos. Um, and so to then try to say that, well, no, the Bible's teaching that God is always opposed to this, God is universally a God of order and chaos is universally evil, and you can just intersperse these ideas with each other. You can't really do that. Um, Not the least because it's not dualistic. There's a conceptual distinction between the antisocial and the
Mm-hmm.
immoral and the um, void negating and indifferently destructive. And one of the main things that this kind of warfare theology dualism has to do is smash those together, um, which you can read any number of books of people trying to do that, but it's artificial because the Bible itself doesn't do that ever. What you also have is the other component of this warfare theology that doesn't involve the chaos creatures involves foreign gods. You'll hear this one a lot more often, actually. It's based on a mistranslation of one of the Psalms that says the gods of the nations are demons. And it has to do with a lot of what people think is a rationalization of the prohibitions against idolatry in Israel. So the idea that the evil forces of that threaten to destroy the world are not just the Leviathan; they're the gods of the enemy nations, and this is what gives people their particular readings of Daniel 10 and Psalm 82.
Mm,
But remember when I talked about category combining? Gods, pretty much by definition, are creatures of the ordered world, and that includes the foreign gods of Israel's neighbors. They're supposed to be establishing order in their nations, protecting their people, all these sorts of things. The accusations against them in the polemics are specifically that they can't do this. They are helpless to prevent their nations from being destroyed. They do not bother to reinforce justice. They don't punish their representative kings for miscarriages of justice. They are weak and incompetent rulers, and they cannot protect. They cannot save Israel. Why are you worshiping these things? They're useless. I'm your God. I can do these things. That's You never see chaos monsters being depicted as weak, impotent, and helpless. That's part of the point of what
mm,
they are.
mm,
They're the cosmic destroyers, and they're always really good at it. And there's also no association with the foreign gods as creatures of chaos. Um, they're they don't they're people who are undermining the order of the system that they're supposed to be protecting. They're not outsiders, and you have these two very distinct ideas that then people want to artificially mash together and say, oh no, these are the same thing. The the gods of the nations are the same thing as the Leviathan, are the same thing as the sons of God in Psalm 82 and Genesis 6, are the same thing as the serpent. And there's no basis for any of that in any of the way that those words and ideas are actually used, based on
mm,
not only how they're used in the text when they mention, but also on what they mean if you go into the culture and look at what those words refer to.
mm, yeah. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate you saying that. Okay, so there was a few passages I wanted to go over, uh, some for clarity, some because they're just really, really interesting. And uh, the I just want to get your thoughts on it. So tell us what the Bible is affirming, not affirming, um, and maybe even some misconceptions about the passage. So an obvious one is Matthew 4 and Luke 4, if I get those references right, where it's
Yeah.
Satan and Jesus are in the wilderness. And of course, as everybody knows, after getting baptized, I guess, Jesus, he goes to the wilderness and Satan's there, and Satan's like, I'm going to give you all these things. All you have to do is, turn your back on God, basically. And Jesus is like, no, I'm not going to do that. He withstands the test. So this is, a very popular passage. What is the biblical text teaching in this? Because like this seems like it's part of the Gospels, historical narrative, right? If you want to call it that, and Satan's in it, so like it seems like this is something that is happening. Satan, Jesus are they're there. So what do you? How can you say that Satan is not being taught in this passage?
So there's a lot of assumptions that are built into that interpretation of what's going on here.
Okay.
Um, and one of the main ones that you brought up is you said this is a historical narrative. That's an assertion about genre, and it's also because you're speaking in English to an English audience. It carries some connotations about what they think the content is.
Mm,
So history as a genre in your ancient world, specifically, that's where it matters, is
hmm
a story about people and events. And specifically, it's a story about people and events that is designed as a commentary on the conditions of the present. So they want to tell how things got the way they are as a way to talk about what things are now. They are curated stories,
mm,
and they are they're told with a point. They are they're a kind of social commentary more than anything else. Would be how we would look at it. Now,
Hmm.
our history, if you talk to an actual historian, does that too. But
Hmm.
when we say that this thing is a historical narrative, especially when we're talking about what does the Bible affirm in the context of a historical narrative, we are assuming an approach to history and to events and the past that is essentially what I can only call forensic. The idea that we are trying to document what a security camera overlooking the scene would have seen. That's what when we say that this is history, that's what we like to think history is. Um, and so if you're a modern historian,
Hmm.
that's kind of what you're trying to do. You're trying to reconstruct camera footage. And it's your evidence for this consists of a lot of documentation about evidence for this is what was going on at this time. Here's how I know that. Here's why I think that. Anybody looking
Hmm.
at this evidence who knew what they were talking about would come to the same conclusion. Um, a classical historian doesn't work that way. Again, they're doing social commentary. They're having insights. A lot of the times they're appealing to their own insightfulness. They're closer to a commentator than a scientist. So when like Luke appeal does a lot of Luke's a historian, so that's the genre of Luke and Acts pretty much,
Hmm.
as far as we can tell. He talks about a lot of what I saw with my own eyes or what this person said, and we look at that and
Yeah.
we said, oh, that's documented evidence. That is the data that results from an experiment, and
Hmm.
it's not. Eyewitness testimony is a way to defend your own credibility as an observer. He's doing an analysis and giving what he knows is his interpretation of an event, but he's also establishing himself as a credible interpreter. So this is dealing
Hmm.
with what that genre is, but then going back to what we think it is. We think that it's a security camera. So God, through whatever method of inspiration, has a camera pointed down at the desert, and there's a transcript of dialogue that this is the person who was there. We ran a background check. We figured out who it was. This is what they said, and they're presenting that as raw footage, as evidence that the reader of this text can analyze in any way they want.
Yeah.
So that kind of doing history, where history is a presentation of data, puts the effort of analysis onto the reader, whereas the classical idea of history and what the Gospels actually are puts the analysis on the writer. So you can imagine the best way I've come up with to describe this is compare. Say you've got a movie set, and they've got the stage set, you've got the actors there, and you've got the big camera up in the front with the director behind it, and then you've got a security camera up in the corner that's watching the whole thing. That can see it sees the stage, it sees the camera equipment, sees the lights, sees the actors, sees all the staff in the background. And when the security camera in the corner is what we think of when we think of documentary footage, this kind of forensic history. Whereas what they're really doing is closer to the big camera that's the movie camera. Now, both of them are recording things that are happening in this room on this stage. But the footage that we have is the footage that's come from the movie camera. That's been shot with a very narrow field of view, aiming at something very specific in that room.
Hmm.
And not only that, has been taken, run through post production, and put into a part of a broader story that is the movie. So when you
Hmm.
see a scene on screen in the movie theater, um, again, taking visual effects out of the picture for now. That's real. That's something that really happened. Those people were in the room doing and saying what they were doing and saying. The actors were there. This is an authentic record of something that happened. But
Yeah.
when you see that, what you try to do is you try to see how does what they're saying, what these people are saying, what they're doing, how does that fit into the plot of this movie? You're not trying to say, okay, what was happening on the set, on that stage, in that room at the time when this was shot.
Mm.
Because, and if you wanted to, you couldn't. The movie camera does not have the information in it that the security camera does.
Hmm.
The the scene, the close up scene of the actors doing the performance that you see in the movie doesn't have the director and the staff running around behind the scenes. It doesn't have the bit of the set that wasn't finished that they had to cut off. It doesn't show the 32 takes where they all did it wrong. And that doesn't mean that it wasn't real, that it never happened, that those people that were never there never said things never existed. It has to do with what we're supposed to do with that information that we have. And so
Mm.
when we take a passage like Luke 4 and say,
Mm.
okay, what does this say? What's Satan doing? Who is Satan? What's his objective? What's he trying to do? That's trying to reconstruct what's happening on set. What Luke wants to do, Luke's the movie director, he wants us to see what purpose this serves in the plot. And when we're looking at the text for its affirmation, that's the kind of thing we should be looking for. One second. So, and then once we understand that what the genre is trying to do, you can argue about whether or not Gospels count as history or not. I'm not going to get into that. We can assume that for this purposes that they do, that they're a commentary. It's trying to talk about trying to tell the early Christian community who Jesus is, what he did, why it's important. That's what its genre is. It's a commentary on the writer's present. It's not a documentary of things Jesus did for trivia. And the way that's what the plot of the movie is ultimately contributing to. And so when you're watching this scene, you want to know, what does that scene contribute to the plot? Why are the characters cast this way? And that's especially true for the temptation narrative because of how it's set, where it takes place. Now, Luke, Matthew, Mark are not sitting there next to Jesus with a notepad watching what he does and who he talks to for 40 days in the wilderness. This is presented as almost a visionary experience, like specifically when the devil takes Jesus up to the temple. We don't have or shows him all the kingdoms of the world. The devil does not like teleport Jesus up on Jerusalem so that all the tourists that day is going to look up and say, "Oh, who's that up there? And how did they get there?" He doesn't take him on a walking tour around the known world. And I'm going to show you all the kingdoms of the world. Here, this is Rome. See that? There's the Colosseum. Oh, that's cool. Let's go down and check out North Africa. That's not what it is. It's set in a context of imagery and typology that means things. So why is it set in the wilderness? Why does Jesus go there? And it's probably what most people think is that it's a recapitulation of Elijah getting sent out into the wilderness and fed by ravens. This is a prophetic typology. It's establishing Jesus as a certain kind of person. That's one suggestion. It's not my favorite one, but it's one that you can do. In the book, the one I suggested is that, especially in Matthew, Jesus' life story is depicted in such a way that it recapitulates Israel's history. And he makes a point out of this. So Jesus is in the wilderness, in Matthew at least, And it's not necessarily the same reason in every gospel it has it. Jesus is in the wilderness with Matthew, and Jesus is in the wilderness for Matthew because Israel was in the wilderness at that point in their story. And
Mm.
so what is happening in the wilderness? Why this whole thing was important enough for them to all put in their gospels has to do with the significance of what Jesus is doing there. It's like at the end of John, he has an offhand comment of like, oh yeah, and Jesus did a whole bunch of other stuff, and there's not enough room in this book to write all about it. Okay, so why did you pick the stuff you picked? What made that
Yep.
important? What made that worth writing about? And you always ask that because these writing texts are always curated. So why
Mm.
was this important enough to the message that Matthew, Mark, Luke wanted to say that they all put it in there? And by the way, John doesn't. Um, and the, what I came up with was the idea that if this is recapitulating Israel in the wilderness, well, why? What does that matter? Why would this matter? That Jesus is tempted and does not succumb to temptation, and that word tempt is the same word that it uses in Exodus when Yahweh tests Israel in the wilderness to see if they will be faithful and loyal to him. And so what I think the point of that passage is that Jesus succeeds where Israel failed. Jesus is the loyal Israel and has
Mm.
fulfilled the covenant perfectly where historical Israel did not. And this is a major theme in especially Matthew's gospel, but it's a component in all of them. And if that's
Mm.
true, if that's what this story is about, then all of the details that they bothered to include somehow contribute to telling that story. And if that's true, then the things that Jesus has to do as a test and who he gets the test from are
Mm.
all based on trying to help communicate that this is a test of covenant fidelity, recapitulating Israel. So
Mm.
So Jesus is going to be asked. So who's going to be giving the test? In the Old Testament, it's God gives the test. In Exodus, it's very explicit. By the time you get to the New Testament and reception of this material, they're much less comfortable with this idea. They don't like the idea of God testing people because it looks like he's setting them up to fail, and that
Yeah.
doesn't sit well with them. So when you look at Second Temple interpretations of Job or of Israel in the wilderness or of Abraham in Genesis 22,
Yep.
they they add in that Satan is the one giving the test. He has God's permission to do it, just like he does in Job in the actual biblical
Mm-hmm.
version. But
Yep.
this is who does this. This is how their worldview works. And so the idea of the Spirit sending Jesus into the wilderness so that Satan can
Mm.
test him is perfectly in line of the idea of Satan asking God permission to test Job, Satan asking God permission to test Abraham, which you see in Jubilees and in a couple other places, Satan getting permission to test Israel in the wilderness that you see in
Yep.
some interpretations of that material. And this again goes to the idea of that's why they cast this character. That character's name means something. They know who he is, and that's a contributing factor to trying to make the point that they're trying to make. And then that's at the same time, what is Satan getting him to do? Now, when your systematic theology looks at this passage, where they're seeing this as this is a forensic transcript of a dialogue of a person that Jesus
Yeah.
talked to, it's like, okay, anybody could have talked to Jesus, but it's this guy, and his name is Satan. Okay, note that for later. We'll do some systematic studies to see who that is. Well, what does he want? We can figure out what he wants by saying what he asked for Jesus. So let's look at that. Oh, um, he wants he wants food. No, that's not right. No one said he wants food. Um, he wants he wants to see something fancy. He wants Jesus to fall off the temple and see some angels catch him. That's going to be cool. No, that's not what he wants either. He wants to be worshipped. There we go. That's what he wants. That tells us everything we need to know about him. Um, and it's not. It doesn't work that way. It's no. Those two kind of facetious examples were another reason. Nobody thinks that because Satan tells Jesus to make bread, that Satan wants bread. Nobody thinks that because Satan wants to see Jesus jump off the temple, that Satan likes seeing people jump off the temple. Um, it's he's subjecting Jesus to the same conditions that Israel in the wilderness got subjected to. So Israel in the wilderness likes to complain about food. All the time they're complaining about food. And God even gave them food. He gave them, ironically, bread. And they still weren't happy about it. So they whine and whine and whine and whine and whine. And finally, God gives them food. Whereas Jesus didn't have any food. He's been starving for 40 days, and he still doesn't ask for food.
Yep.
So again, this is he succeeds where Israel fails. Um, them they go up to the temple, and the devil tells them to jump off to see what God will do, just because you can. And then he quotes back and says, "Don't put the Lord your God to the test," which actually is a quote from Deuteronomy, which is a quote from Exodus, which is about the water at the well, seeing whether or not God would be faithful, and God wasn't happy with that. So this is again, Jesus does what he was supposed to do where Israel did not. And then you get to the third one, which is, I will give you all the kingdoms of the world if you bow down and worship me. Um, Israel likes worshiping other gods. Um,
Mm.
and there, if you look at some of the polemics in Ezekiel, especially, there's you went and served other gods and they gave you nothing. They've not delivered you from their enemies. They've not delivered you from plague and disease. Your country's a mess. And why are you even doing this? You didn't even get anything out of it. Whereas Jesus, again, taking all the tests, making them superlative, he's going to get something out of this if he does this, and he still refuses. Again, succeeding where Israel did not, proving covenant faithfulness. And that's more the point. It's not about whether or not the devil wants to be worshipped. Some of the traditions that you get from this time would say that he would. Others that he wouldn't care about something like that. It's not about whether or not he actually has authority to dispense all the kingdoms of the world. Again, it's only meaningful because they assume that he does, that this is something he could do. Um, and how exactly they think that works, again, it depends on who exactly you're referring to, which we don't have enough detail to know. But none of this is new information. This is all in keeping about what this character Satan is and does. But all of that is there contributing to a story about who Jesus is and why that matters. And that's why it's in the Gospels everywhere that it is.
Yeah.
It's using names and ideas and references to trajectories of biblical interpretation that are meaningful for the audience, because that's how communication works. They have to use meaningful ideas. But when we're reading it now, we have to kind of reconstruct both sides of it, because we're not the people who know this background intuitively. So we have to kind of put ourselves in the place of the person listening to it and be like, okay, what did they already know? What would they have thought about what this genre of text was doing? What would this information have meant to them, and why would they have thought it was important enough to tell them? So the idea of, oh, Satan tempts people, that's not even new for them. That's essentially the definition of what the character is and does. They wouldn't need a gospel narrative to tell them that. It's inherent in the name. If you didn't know any of that, if you did hypothetically try to read it as a blank slate, there's not really anything in that narrative that even says he's evil. He's a agent of the Spirit who has sent him into the wilderness to be tested. He's God's employee, essentially, is the best description of him that you get in there. And you only get the idea that this is connotations of evil of this because you know who the character is, because that name means something. But you have to take what that name means in the context of the people who were using it, and the people who were using it as a meaningful way to talk to each other.
Yeah. Well, that's a long explanation, but I really do appreciate that. That makes a lot of sense, and that's very helpful for just reading the passage in general. So, hopefully a little bit shorter on these other ones here, but uh, Matthew 12:28. So the text says, "But if it is by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you." So this is Jesus talking, I believe. And but anyways, this is in Matthew either way. So it says it seems that Matthew is taking the authority of Jesus' mission on his exorcism. Um, what do you think
Um,
about that?
I think that this has to do with it's important not to just take a soundbite. You have to look at the entire conversation that's happening and who it's
Okay.
happening with, and and again, always, why was this bit important enough for them to stick in the limited space they have when they were telling the story? So that's that verse that he quoted. That's only half a thought, and the first half of that thought is that Jesus performed an exorcism, and a crowd of people was really impressed by that, and the Pharisees are watching, and they don't like that the crowd's impressed by that, so they all point at him and say, "Hey, no, he's using the power of demons to do that."
Yeah.
And then um, and then it goes on. So the question is not the question that this is the conversation they're having that this is an argument about is whose power is Jesus using? Is he using the Spirit of God or is he using the power of Satan?
Mm,
And the answer that he gives, including that passage, is an answer to that question: whose power is this, and what does that mean? In this case, either way. Um,
mm,
and this is one example of very many throughout the Gospels where Jesus puts his enemies in a position where any answer they give to the question he sets up is wrong.
yeah.
So if they say you're using the power of demons to drive out demons, okay, um, let's assume that's true. What does that mean? Um, Satan's house is divided; his kingdom is ended. Um, can Satan drive out Satan? And if that's true, if Satan's house is divided and his kingdom is ended, well, that means that's one of the main signs of the Messianic age, that the end is coming, and we need to be on the lookout for the Messiah. We need to be getting our house in order. All of these ideas that are built into the idea of the Messianic eschatological age, which is a thing that they already knew about.
Mm,
Um, so even if the Pharisees are right, that's something that they need to be worried about. But he said, but if I guess by demons by the Spirit of God, now the Spirit of God is active on earth again. This is another sign of the coming of the Messianic age, and it's one that they should be paying even more attention to. So
yep.
it's basically turning this actually kind of serious accusation back on the people who are making it and making them look bad. And this happens frequently throughout Jesus's exchanges with his enemies, that all of the bad things that they say about him either contradict themselves or make them look bad too. But the point is, um, so is Jesus's ministry tied to exorcism? You could ask that, whether or not this passage teaches that. Could you ask that? Um, and so this gets back into something we talked about earlier. What is exorcism? What does it do? It
Hmm.
cures a disease. Being demon afflicted is a medical condition that can be cured in this way. Is Jesus the only person who can do that? Apparently not. There's um, even in even in the Bible, there's people other than Jesus and his apostles who can apparently do this. And if you look at texts outside the Bible for how exorcism works, there were
Mm,
exorcists who could apparently cure whatever this affliction was. We don't know how they did it or why it worked because, again, we don't even know what it was. Um, and the so it's a form of healing is what's important. Jesus is a healer, and when he when John's disciples come and ask him, "How do we know you're the Messiah?" He gives a list the blind see, the lame walk, these things. I'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't say and the demon possessed are cured on that list. I don't think it does. Um, in in Luke, he sends out 72 apostles to do a bunch of things, a bunch of healing things, none of which include exorcism. They apparently did do some exorcism because they come back and say, "Wow, that really worked well." Um, but again, even his response to that is, um, "Yeah, it does, but don't rejoice too much that the spirits submit to you. Rejoice that your name is written in heaven." Um,
Mm-hmm.
de-emphasizing it. Um, so it's the fact that he can do exorcisms, among other things, like curing blindness, curing lameness, curing leprosy, um, is important. It's a sign of the reoccurrence on earth of the Spirit of God in the Messianic age. This is one of the things that they're looking for, but not exorcism by itself, and not
Mm-hmm.
explicitly.
Okay, so specifically, so you're saying that the text is saying that, uh, yeah, maybe just for clarity, I don't want to misrepresent you there. So, in a short, concise way, what would you say that this text is teaching? Like, why is this there?
Um, this text is answering an accusation that was apparently common enough that it gets made a bunch of times in the gospel narratives itself, and possibly the reading audience of the gospels would have been confronted with,
Uh-huh.
or been worried about themselves. So the idea is, oh yeah, that guy you're following was a sorcerer, was a demoniac.
Mm,
Um, that again, that's a real accusation, and it's potentially one that persists beyond Jesus' own life. Again, it's
mm-hmm.
and it could potentially be a reassurance to anybody who has this same question that the Pharisees did, um, of what the answer to that is, to be able to give the same answer. It could also be a significance of Jesus' squabbles with the Pharisees have a lot to do with, um, authority and, divine representation and divine power.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever Jesus beats the Pharisees at their own game, it's kind of enforcing his legitimacy over theirs, because we do know that the Jewish community, who's the audience of the Gospels, is in conflict about who they should go with. The Christian and Jewish communities have split. So,
Mm-hmm.
do they stay in the synagogue and those teachers, or do they follow the Christians and their teacher?
Yep.
And having Jesus make the synagogue leaders look bad and look not very good at their jobs could be part of the reinforcement of, you made the right choice, this is the better teacher.
Mm,
So either of those
okay.
two, or possibly a combination of those two.
Mm, okay. So possibly the text is teaching that the Pharisees are not worth following. It's Jesus who's worth following, and then the other way to say it was, what was the other one?
That that Jesus was not a sorcerer, was not using demonic
Okay,
power
gotcha.
to
Okay,
do all of his miracles. And again, you should note that
gotcha.
that passage in particular doesn't say, it's a conditional. If I cast by the kingdom, if I
Yeah.
cast out demons by the finger of God, then the kingdom of God has come among you.
Mm,
He doesn't say, I tell you the truth, I cast by this power.
yep.
Um, it's not in this one anyway.
Okay.
Um,
All right. Yeah, 1 John 3:8. So whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. So we have this idea of the devil is a sinner and that the devil has been sinning from the beginning. So a lot of people think, hey, that's a reference to Genesis. But either way, what and maybe even the devil is the serpent according to the writer First John. But in this case, what is the text teaching?
okay, so I have to look into what's happening in this passage? What do the words mean? So if you're
Mm.
going to go into from the beginning, that's an idiom, and it doesn't mean like at the beginning of time or from when you started counting. Um,
Okay.
it means it emphasizes longstanding consistency. It's always been that way. Um,
No.
uh, so the devil is a sinner and always has been. Um,
No.
the other, this is actually a very similar construct to a passage that you see in John 8, where he says that the devil is a liar and a murderer from the beginning.
Mm.
And there's a lot of question about what that is actually a reference to because it's very difficult to figure out who the devil supposedly murdered. Um,
Mm.
the Satan character in the Old Testament never kills anybody except Job's children.
Right.
That doesn't really count because God told him to do it. Um, so it's not an Old Testament reference. And there's some people want to think it wants to refer to Cain, but that wasn't the devil. That was Cain. Even if Cain is the child of the devil, which is sometimes a tradition, that's still
Yeah.
not that. So the idea is more that this refers to typology. The devil
Mm.
is a liar and a murderer. So why is Jesus saying that? Um, does he have a specific lie or a specific murder in mind that he wants to
Mm.
reference? Um,
Yeah.
is he trying to tell something about the devil character that they don't already know? That you think this guy is a great guy, but I'm here to tell you. Um, and I don't think either of those are true. I think John 8 especially is a very long series of contrasting typologies of who are children of God, who are children of Abraham, who are children of the devil.
Mm.
And all of that is based on, it's not based on um, genealogy, who's physically descended from who. It has to do with child of, in this case, is who acts according to the way a follower or disciple of this person should.
Mm.
And if that's if that's what's going on, then
Mm.
calling Satan a liar and a murderer isn't necessarily informing the Pharisees. So the Pharisees aren't like, oh yeah, we're following Satan. He's a great guy. And Jesus is like, no, have you read this passage? He lied and he killed somebody. That's not what they're doing. They know who Satan is. They know he's bad. They know that anything bad that you can think of, which includes things like lies and murder, are the kind of things that his followers would do. So Jesus picks those specifically in this passage because lies and murder are exactly what he's accusing the Pharisees of. He says, you lot there, you say that you're children of God, but you're conspiring to kill me. You say that you're children of
Mm.
God, but you're teaching falsehoods." So he says, "So you're a liar, you're a murderer, you're a child of the devil, who was a liar and the murderer, and always has been." And it's not talking about who the devil is or what the devil did. It's associating people typologically with something that they wouldn't want to be. The Pharisees don't want to be children of the devil. They know who that is. They know that's bad. That's a
Yeah.
meaningful insult to them because of that. And when you look at First John, it's doing exactly the same thing. It's talking about who are the children of righteousness, who are the children of devil. The
I
children of
see.
righteousness do good. The children of God, the children of the devil sin because the devil's a sinner. Same as the
Mm.
children of the devil lie and murder because the devil's a liar and a murderer. It's not looking for a specific instance where the devil
Mm.
sinned. Again, they know that. They know that that's part of what the character is. It's talking about what his children do, what his followers would do in a typological relationship. And again, this is a commentary on people who sin based on the idea that those people would not be happy about being associated with the devil because nobody's happy about being associated with the devil.
Yeah.
Um,
Right.
so I can talk a little bit about references to Genesis or lack thereof as well if you want to. Um,
Yeah,
but
yeah, might as well.
okay, so um, there is no reference in Genesis to the serpent being the devil. There's no reference in Genesis to the serpent sinning. There's not even any
Mm,
reference in Genesis to Adam and Eve sinning. That's
mm,
all. That all comes in Second Temple post biblical reception,
yep.
and it it does for a couple of reasons. Most of the time, it's because they want to use Adam and Eve's story as a recapitulation of Israel's story. It's they're kind of they have a bit of a laser focus on this idea of um, promise, uh, that promise, infidelity, punishment, and restoration. So
Hmm.
when they're telling this story about Adam and Eve, they usually refer to a whole bunch of ideas of how they're going to potentially be redeemed, or um, and other times it still has to do with the nature of the story. So they're recapitulating Israel. That's one of the places where it comes from. But more importantly, since we're talking about the devil and the serpent, it is
Hmm.
very, very rare in Second Temple literature for the devil and the serpent to be conflated into the same character.
Hmm.
I found one text that did it, and it was actually based around a an extension of the Day of Atonement ritual, where sin is removed from humans and placed onto Azazel. And it takes
Yep.
that character Azazel from Leviticus, combines it with that same character in post biblical reception of Genesis 6, where he's one of the sons of God who descend from heaven in Genesis 6, and then conflates both of those with the serpent character. That's the only one I could find that did it. Usually they're two different characters, and sometimes they're not both even there. So the idea that the devil is the serpent and that's obvious is not something that you get in the background of the Bible, and it's not something you get
Hmm.
in the Bible itself. I didn't find the first place where someone did say it, but it's again, I guess I did in the when they're Azazel in the Apocalypse of Abraham, but um, it's not common, and it's so a casual reference to Satan would not automatically invoke the serpent, and likewise, a casual reference to the serpent wouldn't automatically invoke Satan either.
Hmm. Yeah. Right. 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 So really, I mean, you have as far as just the specific passage goes, when we're talking about like what words are used and comparing what actually happens in the Genesis text, you have very little to go off of. So you have this idea of sinning, which isn't in Genesis
In the New Genesis,
for the devil. The devil in general, like that's speculative. At least whether First John thought that the devil was the serpent, and then you also have from the beginning the only possible, like that maybe that's the clearest one, but you yourself, and we have other texts that use this idea from the beginning to just refer to this, it's always happened that way as an idiom. So
this
there,
isn't.
and none
Yeah,
of, I was
yeah.
just going to say that yeah, go for it. What?
The, the text in First John is not telling the audience what the devil is or did or trying to identify a cameo of him in other parts of Scripture. It's
Yeah.
talking about who the children of the devil are and how you can tell that they are the children of the devil based on the assumption that they know what that means and they know that that's bad.
Right, right, right. Okay, so Revelation 12:9 on a similar note, so it says, "And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent, who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world." So, this, can you talk about whether this is a reference to Satan as the serpent from Genesis?
So if you wanted to try to find a reference back to Genesis that puts Satan there, Revelation 12 is the best one you're going to get.
Hmm.
Um, and the reason for that is when the dragon waits to devour the offspring of the woman a couple verses later, that's very clearly a reference back to Genesis 3:15.
Okay.
Um, and that's again a question of is this a retelling of a primordial event? I don't think that it is. It wouldn't be outside of an apocalyptic genre to do that. But in a couple of another reception of Genesis 3:15, it's the idea of God's people persevering against enemy onslaught, and it gets
Hmm.
invoked in that context a lot. So this would seem to be more likely a comment in that same vein that whatever is happening between the woman's child and the dragon,
Hmm.
whoever they respectively represent, um, is one example of this same kind of God's people being subject to combat, but ultimately then being victorious that you see scattered throughout a lot of places. So
Hmm.
the question is whether does the dragon, the ancient serpent, is that a reference back to Genesis 3? And I don't think it is. Firstly, on the basis that the dragon and the serpent are, or the serpent and Satan are not usually conflated. So that would be not necessarily a thing that would naturally make sense. I think it's a reference back to Isaiah 27, where they're talking
Hmm.
about in those days, the Lord will slay
Yep.
Leviathan, the coiling serpent, the gliding serpent, the dragon, and the sea. Um, Based on the language that it's using, so ancient serpent, a dragon that's an ancient serpent, and a dragon that's a coiling serpent is much more closer in terms of its language as a reference,
Yep.
especially in this context of a eschatological conflict, which is what's going on in Revelation, than a
Hmm.
reference to the serpent was the wisest of the beasts of the field in Genesis 3. The language is different. So I also did argue in my book that the both the Leviathan and the Genesis serpent are samples of chaos creatures. So they kind of pool their imagery, and they get the ideas are not entirely inseparable. But
Hmm.
if it's a reference to Genesis, it's still a reference to Genesis. What they're talking about is what's happening to the dragon, what's happening to this offspring. If they're interpreting Genesis 3:15 as a prophecy, which they probably are, then maybe that's relevant. Does that mean that they're telling you to go back and fill in Satan when it says serpent in Genesis and then recalibrate your understanding of Genesis accordingly? I don't think that's what it's doing. That's not the point.
Hmm.
Um, because it's a reference, it's a reference to something. We can argue about a reference to what, and this one you could theoretically make a case that it's a reference to, to Genesis 3. I don't think that's the best explanation, but it's a case you could make. It's still just a
Okay.
reference. It's a passing comment, and it's the only significance you get out of Genesis is that, oh, Genesis 3:15 is relevant here, which you already
Hmm.
knew because it already talked about the the dragon getting ready to smite the woman's child. So it doesn't tell you anything. It would only tell you that this is a reference, and all that tells you is that's a meaningful reference. It doesn't add any information to whatever Genesis is talking about between the interaction of these two characters, and doesn't
Hmm.
because it's not a commentary on Genesis trying to help you identify who characters in Genesis are. Then it doesn't really tell you anything about that either. One of the reasons why they think that's an important reference back to Genesis is because of the comment that the dragon leads the whole world astray.
Mm.
or deceives the whole world, depending which translation you use.
Mm.
And something that I did not actually find when I was writing the Demons book, but I found when I was doing my dissertation on Genesis,
Huh.
is that that's not the same word that they use to refer to Genesis. So I want to say it's in Corinthians 11. There's a comment about uh, just as the serpent deceived Eve, I do not want you to be led astray.
Yep.
Um, and so that shows that what they think the consequence of that's very clearly a reference back to Genesis. And it says that led astray is a consequence of what the serpent in Genesis did. Now, despite your English, that's not the same word it's using in Revelation 12. Babylon leads the whole world astray. But when the dragon slash devil comes out again and deceives the whole world and is let loose, and then is put in the abyss and is let loose again from the abyss to deceive the whole world, that's not the same. That's the same word as Revelation 12 again. They're not the same word as what Corinthians said the serpent did to Eve. So that's the deceives there that it says in English, the serpent deceives.
Mm.
That is not a reference to Genesis because they're using the wrong word. And it's also not the word when in the Greek translation of the Bible when Eve says the serpent deceived me and I ate. It's not that word either.
Mm. Okay. All right. So, if we're talking strictly, I think you could say that it's theoretically possible that they're thinking of the same ideas, but we would expect them if they're referencing that to use the same word.
They'd be
Is that
quite explicit about it. And again, we
yeah,
have we have plenty of texts that are commentaries on Genesis that are explaining what actually happened in the garden and what the significance of that is.
um,
They're not in the Bible, and most of those do not have the serpent and the devil being the same character.
mm, right,
Um,
right, right, right.
so it's there might be again. There's one I found one that does. There may have been more. That may have been an understanding that they had. We know it's an understanding that they developed
Yep,
eventually. It's never explicitly the point of any text in the Bible that might or might not happen to mention it.
yep. It's okay if you're not prepared, but Revelation 20 verse 2 also has a kind of similar point. It says, actually, no, that was Revelation 12:9. Let me repeat that. Revelation 22 says, he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil or Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years.
Again, I think that's a reference to Isaiah 27
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Hmm.
because the language is more similar than to Genesis 3. And again, they want to latch in on the whole leads astray or deceives bit, but like I said, that's a different word.
Hmm.
And that's a confusing feature of English. But I'm assuming that they didn't use the same word, or it's reasonable to assume that they didn't use the same word for a reason. If they had wanted to make that a reference, they could have.
Yes, yes. That makes sense. Okay. All right. So John 13:27 says, as soon as Judas took the bread, Satan entered into him. So Jesus told him, what you are about to do it quickly. So many people see that as like Satan has the ability to possess people, take control of them. Um, and of course, you also have this idea also of the demons being able to do that too. Uh, what is the biblical text teaching in this passage?
Well, again, you want to look at the the people who are watching this event, the people who are remembering and writing this event, the people that they're writing it to, and the story that they're trying to tell as they do it. So
Yep.
John, we assume this is John, is there at the feast. Does he like suddenly see Judas start twitching and like gurgling and roll his eyes back and do a bunch of exorcist stuff, and then like come back up with his eyes all black and his hair on fire? We don't. This isn't something. Satan entering someone isn't something you can see. It's not a phenomenon of an event. It's like when Jesus calls Peter Satan in in the get thee behind me, Satan comment.
Yeah.
This is identifying an agency at work. And it's saying that now, at this point, Judas is doing the devil's work. And this is, what is the point of him saying that? Is he trying to say that Judas now doesn't have control? Judas is not responsible for what's happening. Judas is not guilty from this point on. Very clearly not. Judas is the Son of Man will go just as was written about him, but woe to the person who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had never been born. There's no attempt to try to make Judas not responsible, to try to shift responsibility for what Judas is doing onto Satan. This is a commentary about Judas's actions. And again, based on the idea that you don't want to be associated with Satan and doing the work of Satan. Everyone knows that's bad because everyone knows who Satan is. So why is that important? John has a lot of imagery about the passion, recapitulating elements of the eschatological battle, specifically that the other gospels don't. So it could be an element in this, that this is not Jesus. This is not a political thing about Jesus versus a bunch of other humans. This is a cosmic encounter of the Logos versus the devil. And that's John's imagery has this throughout. So it's setting the stage for this symbolic encounter by casting the enemy. There's also, we know from external evidence that there's a narrative circulating around Christianity that Jesus was a dangerous criminal who they were lucky that they got him. And in that narrative, Judas would be a hero, somebody who is helping acting in the public interest by bringing a dangerous person to justice. So if you just have forensic history, if you just have a list of facts of person here did what, for any audience to analyze however they like, there's a couple of different ways to interpret Judas. If anybody has seen Jesus Christ Superstar, that interprets Judas as being a voice of reason trying to put the brakes on some kind of weird, fanatical, obsessive thing that's gotten out of control. Again, what I just talked about, the story that gets circulated about Christianity of you guys are worshiping a criminal, what's wrong with you, depicts Jesus as seditious, as an enemy of the state. And there's actually a lot of stuff that's done in all of the Gospels to emphasize that, no, that's not true. Jesus was crucified unjustly. He did not commit sedition. We are not endorsing sedition. We are good citizens. The whole shebang that they do before Pilate, it's not the Romans that arrest him, it's the Jewish leaders, and the Romans don't care. They're like, we've found nothing wrong with this man, let him go. We found nothing wrong with this man, let him go. They repeat this over and over again because they want to make a point, and this is very important for the reading audience of the Gospels, that this guy's not a criminal, that the Romans did not execute him for sedition, therefore there's no real reason to execute his followers for sedition either. And that's a huge issue because they're doing that. So the interpretation of the Passion narrative includes this element. And casting Judas as the betrayer, as the person who has committed a grave act of dishonor of turning on a friend, turning on a teacher, who then shows horrible remorse and dies dishonorably, is buried dishonorably. It's so contaminated that they can't even take the money back that they paid him. All of this is part of telling the story about how Jesus is a righteous and innocent man who was executed unjustly by conspiracy. And that's a very important message in and of itself, even before you then lay on the cosmic close of the eschatological age on top of that, which John is doing. So it's those elements together that have Judas is a bad guy and doing a bad thing is the most important element of that. And then you get your
Yeah.
undertones fitting into the gospel's themes, whichever it is, which is going to change which gospel is pitching him that way. Um, adds something to it, but it's not giving you information about Satan. It's giving you information about Judas, and it's giving you information about Judas so that you can understand what's happening in the Passion narrative.
So you don't think that this is just like metaphorical language? Satan entered him to say, "Hey, he did something bad." Like,
I mean, the idea that the devil can influence people
yeah.
is something that they all would have assumed that he could do. Um,
Hmm.
did the devil actually like wear him like a suit and move him like a marionette? I have no idea. Um, there's there's not a lot of evidence of that. The closest you get to that of a um, of a spirit being inside you is in the the divination spirit in Philippi, where it's delivering prophecy. It's sitting in the oracle's stomach and speaking through her mouth. And it's not that thing is not like in her brain controlling her actions. It's using her as a microphone essentially. Um, and this is a thing that you could do. This is a form of divination that they
Mm.
knew how to practice. Um, and so I think it's more about just like when Jesus rebukes Peter and says, "Get thee behind me, Satan." It's showing where these actions and ideas are coming from, less so than giving you a some metaphysics on agency or on um, mechanics of spirits and people switching off control of people's bodies, minds, and
Mm.
words. Um, I if there's a specific technical meaning of entered into him, that they would have known what that meant, that this was a process.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. I haven't found it. That would be interesting if anyone did. Um,
Okay.
but it doesn't. Judas is not acting afterwards like a demoniac. He's not acting like the people in the tombs who can't be restrained with chains and who are filthy and who are running
Mm.
around screaming. He's not randomly throwing himself into a fire. Um, he's not even loudly saying things and being obnoxious like the one in Philippi was doing. So there's no real correlation between whatever he's doing and what they would call demon possession,
Mm.
which makes me think that this is that the writers claim that Satan is now involved in what he's doing, not doing things instead of him, but involved in what he's doing, is a way to evaluate those actions and to comment on Judas's character from this point on.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really interesting. Okay. All right. So last one here. So Acts 26:17-18 says, "I will rescue you from your people and from the Gentiles. I'm sending you to them to open their eyes and turn them from darkness to light and from the power of Satan to God, so that they may receive forgiveness of sins and place among those who are sanctified by faith in me." So many people think this verse teaches there is opposition between Satan and God, and that the gospel is how the control over Satan is broken. So I would assume you don't take that position. Uh, why
No, I
do you not
don't.
take that? And what is this text affirming?
So the idea of the world being divided between the people of God and the people of Satan is a very common way of understanding the world in Second Temple Judaism, and the details of it are going to vary depending on who you're talking to. Um, but it pretty much invariably has the Jewish people are the people of God and the Gentiles are not. Therefore, they are the people of Satan, because that's the alternative. So it's and sometimes and most of the time they get a lot more narrow. They want to say that no, actually our little sect within Judaism are the people of God, and all the Gentiles, of course, but also all of these other Jews who, don't follow the laws that we like, don't follow the high priest that we like, don't go to the temple that we would like, all of these other things. They're the people of Satan too, and there's
Hmm.
a lot of that going around in Second Temple period, but it's always includes the Gentiles because the Gentiles are not the people of God by definition. So the idea that the Gentiles could be converted and become the people of God is something that comes up in in Second Temple Judaism that doesn't happen in ancient Israel in the Old Testament. So they talk about the Pharisees, going for 1,000 miles over land and sea to make one convert. You can do this. You can take Gentiles and make them Jewish and therefore bring them into the people of God, have them switch sides. When they talk about the eschatological conflict, they imagine this is going to be a war between the Jewish people and the non-Jewish people, um, and sometimes the Jewish people who have apostatized, with
Hmm.
their respective supernatural sponsors on both sides. Um, I think this is the same imagery that Daniel 10 is ultimately using. Um,
Hmm.
but the it's not telling telling people that, you think that the Gentiles are just, these people who dress funny and eat weird food. But no, I want to tell you that they're actually under control of Satan. Do you know who that is? Well, you might not. So I'm going to tell you who that is. He's a sinner, he's a liar, he's a murderer, and he makes the Gentiles do all those things too. No, there's none of that. They know
Hmm.
who Satan is. They know that the Gentiles, by virtue of not being part of the people of God, are the people of Satan, because that's how the world works. And this idea that you could go and recruit from that camp is not a uniquely Christian idea. Um, they have some very unique ideas about how that is done, which is what actually a lot of the New Testament is about, whether they have to become Jewish first. And there's a lot of fights about that. But there's not a lot of dispute about we are rescuing people from the grip of the darkness and the devil and bringing them into the light and the people of God. Everybody knows that's what's happening because that's how the world works.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. All right. I appreciate all that. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on here. It's been a lot of fun and going diving through this. Uh, we're gonna have to keep having you on here to talk about all kinds of different things. But
Right?
thank you so much for coming on here. Any last thoughts before
Well,
we
thank
get
you.
going?
I was going to say, no, I don't think so. I think we've probably gone on for long enough. If I think of anything else, we can
Okay.
have another podcast.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much. I do hope
Thank
you
you.
have a good rest of your night.